I'd like to talk today about Black Governor Sam Huntington. Sam has not completely been lost to history. You often find historians talking about him when they mention the Black governors in Connecticut. Sam was a resident of Norwich, Connecticut, and is supposed to have been the Black governor there. Much of what you read, though, is regurgitated from prior sources with very little actual archival research being done on him. And I would like to change that using sources, facts, and archival records. First of all, what is a Black governor? Black governors were a phenomenon mostly in Connecticut, a couple other New England states, which was basically a ceremonial office. In colonial Connecticut and through the early 19th century. The local Black residents, both enslaved and free, would hold elections each May to pick their local leader. The office had no real power, although the governor would often settle minor squabbles among his constituents. But they had no jurisdiction over white residents whatsoever. And these chosen governors were usually associated with a powerful and wealthy white family that lived in town. So what's been written about Sam Huntington? Let's start with this, published in 1845 by Frances Mainwaring Calkins in her book, The History of Norwich. She's talking about the Black governors, and she first talks about a man named Boston Trow and his gravestone, which we're going to see a picture of a little bit later. In memory of Boston Trow, governor of the African tribe in this town, who died in 1772, age 66. She goes on to say, after the death of this person, Sam Huntington was annually elected to this mock dignitary for a much greater number of years than his honorable namesake and master, Samuel Huntington, Esquire, filled the gubernatorial chair. And then she goes on with a rather derogatory description of the crowning of this local governor. It was amusing to see this sham dignitary after his election riding through the town on one of his master's horses. Adorned with plated gear, his aides on each side, a la militaire. So she's writing about this kind of in a mocking sort of a manner. So she was the first to write about him. We can find some other information from other researchers and authors, and we'll take a look at some of those examples. In 1899, in Connecticut Magazine, they published Negro Slavery in Connecticut. Sam Huntington, slave to the governor of the same name, was annually elected to this dignity for a much greater number of years than his honorable namesake and master. In 1797, Rose and Brown published their book Tapestry. They are also the authors of the seminal work Black Roots in Southeastern Connecticut, which is an excellent resource guide. Page 37, reportedly Sam Huntington would ride through the town of Norwich on one of his master's horses, adorned with plated gear, his aides at his side in military fashion. They go on to add, Sam was eventually freed by Jabez Huntington on January 24th, 1787. Here's a more recent publication, the Connecticut Current. Some Black governors were chosen for having a master who was governor. This was the case of Sam Huntington, a slave named after the white governor. The white governor was kidded because his slave lasted longer in his post than Huntington did in his. It goes on to provide a list of the Black governors and add some dates that Sam Huntington was the Black governor in Norwich from 1772 until 1800. Those dates pretty much pulled out of thin air. And just a word about Governor Samuel Huntington being kidded because his slave lasted longer in office than he did. Governor Samuel Huntington died in office, so I'm not sure who it was that kidded him about this after his death. One more book about David Ruggles, published in 2010. Sam Huntington, the enslaved man of Governor Samuel Huntington, blah, 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 became governor of Connecticut blacks in his own right. He was not the governor of Connecticut blacks, he was governor of Norwich. After his election, he rode through the town on one of his master's horses with plated gear. Do all of these sound the same? They are just regurgitating and adding some detail of their own to Calkins' narrative published in 1845. The only one that did any sort of research to add to this was James and Brown, who added the fact that Sam was eventually freed by Jabez Huntington in January 1787, and unfortunately, that date is not correct. So did Frances Mainwaring Calkins know what she was talking about? Let's think about that for a minute. What is the source of this information? After her death, her half-brother, Henry P. Havens, published a memorial to her in the New England Historical and Genealogical Society Register. That was in 1869. And on page 402 appears this sentence. Her young friends would gather around her and beg her to tell them a story, and then with a sweet and animated countenance, she would commence the recital of some tale of romantic interest, reproduced perhaps from her reading, or not infrequently drawn from her own imagination. That, in my mind, puts to doubt pretty much anything that she talks about. Now, I'm going to qualify that a bit. She is a respected historian. Her works on Norwich and New London are well respected and often referred to in historical research. However, I don't think that means that we can take everything she said as being truth. For example, if it's true that Sam Huntington was governor from 1772 until 1800, she would not have witnessed one of his coronation days. She was born in 1795. She didn't move to Norwich until 1800. So it's most likely that this spectacle was related to her by one of her tutors, and she accepted it as fact. Another thing about Calkins, if we look further into her history of Norwich, she does talk about emancipation of slaves in Norwich, and she gives two examples. Jabez Huntington can emancipate a Negro man named Guy in 1780, and Joshua Huntington to emancipate his Negro servant Bina in 1781. Well, I went to the town hall in Norwich and looked up the original record of these emancipations. And this is that record. And you see up at the top, you have this Negro man named Guy, as Calkins relates. Down at the bottom of the page, you can see the emancipation record for Bina, as Calkins relates. Right dead center in the page is the emancipation of a servant named Samuel by Jabez Huntington. And you notice the date here is 1781, not 1787. This was recorded in 1787. Brown and Rose got that confused. So why did Calkins leave this out? Why did she mention the first entry and the third entry and completely ignore Samuel? I think because she had been told that Samuel was enslaved by Governor Samuel Huntington. Unfortunately, that is not true. There is no indication that Governor Samuel Huntington ever owned a slave, never mind one named Samuel. Samuel was enslaved and emancipated by Jabez Huntington, who was a very wealthy and very powerful merchant in the town of Norwich. So we've looked at a couple of archival records. What else can we find? Jabez Huntington, as I said, was very wealthy, very powerful, and he was named Major General in charge of all Connecticut troops during the Revolutionary War. He had several sons, all of whom were also involved in the war effort, rising to elevated ranks. His son, Jedediah Huntington, in 1775 was colonel of the local militia. And that was the year in which the siege of Boston occurred, where revolutionary troops surrounded Boston, trying to keep the British bottled up there and not let them out to invade anything else in the country. Jedediah Huntington took his Norwich militia up to the Boston area, Roxbury to be exact, to support that effort. And this is a list of the officers and privates in his company. And down at the bottom of the right-hand column, we can find Samuel, Negro. Now, what makes me think that this is the same Samuel? Jedediah Huntington and his father, Jabez Huntington, wrote numerous letters back and forth throughout their lives, and a lot of those letters have been preserved. And this is a transcription of one of those records where Jedediah is writing to Jabez concerning expenses that he has incurred with three members of his troops. First one is Sam Negro that you see there. The other two in this letter are Rufus Abel and Dyer Manning. Those two were young white men who were apprenticed to Jabez Huntington. So Jedediah is writing here about one enslaved man named Sam and two apprentices named Rufus Abel and Dyer Manning. In another letter from Jedediah to his father, this is November 1775. They're still in camp at Roxbury. And down at the bottom there, you'll see he wants to know if Dyer Manning and Rufus Abel are going to enlist again. But he says that Sam will come home in the expiration of his term, as no Negroes are to be enlisted. Again, in May of 1776, Jedediah to his father, I cannot improve Sam so as to get anything for his service. I should think as he has commenced as a sailor, it would be best to continue him so until an opportunity presents of selling him. So Sam is no longer in the service, and apparently he is serving as a sailor, possibly on one of Jabez's own trading vessels. Jabez luckily did not sell Sam. And again, a few weeks later, Jedediah to his father, as to Sam, I cannot get him into the army without transgressing a rule of Congress, which forbids the enlisting of Negroes unless they have certificates from their masters of their freedom. Jabez would have had to emancipate Sam in order to have him enlist in the service, and he did not do so until 1781, as we've already seen. So this is the same Sam, enslaved by the Jabez Huntington family. One more record about his service. This is a list of arms that were returned at the time that these men left the service in December of 1775. And here we see that Sam turned in a gun, a bayonet, and a cartridge box. I like this list because it makes it obvious that Negroes in the Army were given the same equipment as their white counterparts. There was no differentiation. They were fully integrated into the service. You see all these men return the same sort of equipment. So Sam returned to Norwich. What did he do next? Well, as I said, Jabez had several sons. Another one of them was named Joshua. Joshua was tasked with building a ship in Norwich for the Roar effort, a frigate to be exact, hopefully to be used to fight against the British Navy. This frigate was built, and it was called the Confederacy. And this was authorized in January 1777. Now, of course, the problem is a lot of your able-bodied male workers are off fighting the war. So who's going to build this ship? Quite a few local white men did work on it, but there's also a number of Black men and Native Americans who were involved in the building of the Confederacy. The payroll records exist. They're in Philadelphia. But I did go to Philadelphia to look at them, and I found Samuel Huntington all over the place. This is just one example from August of 1778. Samuel Huntington is working as a blacksmith, and he has worked 5 of the 6 normal work days that week. Almost every week he worked either 5 or 6 days. In November of 1778, they were done with the actual building of the ship in Norwich, and it was floated down to New London for its final fitting out or rigging. And those payroll records can also be found. Here's a rigger's return from November 1778. And there is Sam Huntington, worked 1 day that week on rigging the ship. The Confederacy set sail in early 1779 under Captain Seth Harding. And this is a list of her men and officers in her first voyage. And again, at the bottom of the right-hand column, you'll find Samuel Huntington. As we already know that Samuel had some experience as a sailor, so he apparently was on the first voyage of the Confederacy. He must have returned to Norwich after the first voyage, however, because in 1781, when the Confederacy was captured by the British, all of her men were taken prisoner, and those prisoner lists exist, and Sam is not on the list. So he was back safe in Norwich. The war did finally end, and in 1790, the new United States took their first census. This is a listing from New London County, the section that enumerates Norwich. And here we find Negro Sam, head of a household of 4 other free persons. Again, how do I know that this is the same Sam? Well, it's pretty easy to demonstrate. If we take a look here, this is a map that was drawn in 1895, but it's supposed to show where all the houses existed in Norwich in 1795. And this is a little snippet of a corner of Norwich. That's the Norwich Town Green there, the old burying ground. And you can see we have the houses are numbered, and there is a key there as to who owned the houses. For example, number 86 here was Governor Samuel Huntington. This house over here was owned by Jedediah Huntington. Jabez Huntington's house is just off the top right-hand corner of this map. But interesting to me, on the north side of the road, there is a bunch of shops that by this time had been torn down. You can see in the key there, Jeremiah Leach's shop, Andrew Huntington's shop, Zechariah Huntington's shop, Simeon Huntington's shop. That row of shops there is probably where Sam lived, because we can take that map and we can correlate it to that 1790 census. We know who lived in all these houses. Governor Samuel Huntington, we've got Daniel Abbott, Nathaniel Townsend, David Nivens, Charles Charlton. Those were all on that key to those houses there. And there at the bottom, right in that same neighborhood, is Negro Sam. So again, I believe that he lived either above or behind those shops there in his own household. This is the 1800 census in Norwich. Again, we find Sam, head of household of just 2 people at this time. But you notice there's a little community there of free Black people. William, Jack Backus, Lettice, Cornelius, Sam, James Guy. Remember Guy, who was emancipated by Jabez Huntington. And they're all living near each other. And again, we can see those same names in the neighborhood. Asa Lathrop, Charles Charlton, David Nivens, Nathaniel Townsend. He's still living right in that same neighborhood. And probably all those other families are in that same area, again, either above or behind that row of shops. For a brief time, Sam returned to the sea. This is a record of his Seaman's Protective Certificate that was issued in 1804. Samuel Huntington, born in Norwich, about 45 years old, and it designates that he is a Negro. And we can get an idea of his age from here. He was born somewhere around 1860. Of course, ages changed. This is the 1810 census of Norwich, showing Samuel as the head of household for 3 persons at this time. 2 unfortunate things. One is that we can't find out who these other people were in his household. I hope that it was a wife and children, but we have no way of finding out. There are no other records of birth, marriages, or death for Samuel Huntington in Norwich, except the one we'll talk about in a moment. So we don't know if he was married. We don't know if he had children. We can only kind of guess at it. And unfortunately, the 1810 census is in alphabetical order rather than the order in which it was taken. So we can't tell if he's still living in the same place. Samuel died in 1811. The only record of that is because a man by the name of John Williams was keeping a diary and noting the deaths of various citizens in the town of Norwich. He notes that Samuel, a Negro, doesn't give him a last name, died at age 60. His diary entries were later merged with the congregational church records in Norwich, which is why we have this. Says that he's about 60 years old. That's going to be an estimate. It's not going to be exact, but again, we know that he was born maybe 1750 in this case, somewhere around that area. So let's just summarize what we've learned so far from actual records. He was born roughly 1750. He was a soldier in the Continental Army in 1775. He was a sailor in those years somewhere. Blacksmith in 1778 and a shipbrigger working on the Confederacy. He was a sailor on the Confederacy in 1779. He was emancipated in 1781 and the head of his own household in 1790, 1800, and 1810. He was a sailor again for a bit in 1804, and he died in 1811. At the time that he died, Francis Mainwaring Calkins was 16 years old, still in school. And I'm going to guess that she had heard some stories about his life. You know, when people die, you know, everybody in town was probably talking about it and maybe relating some stories about his life. And this could be where she picked up her ideas about Sam. What we don't know from these records, what we cannot learn, is where Sam was born, any sort of an exact birth date, and we don't know who his parents were. However, I have a theory, and I would like to share that with you. Another letter from Jedediah Hunting to his father. This is when Jedediah was still in college in 1763. He was about ready to graduate college and thinking about having to get all his belongings home. And he writes to his father, "If you can let Boston come down at commencement, he will be very serviceable to me." In other words, he needed help getting all this stuff home. Now, we talked about Boston Trow before. This is his gravestone in the old Norwich Town Cemetery in memory of Boston Trow, governor of the African tribe. He died May 28, 1772, at the age of 66. Boston Trow was also enslaved by Jabez Huntington. Here's another letter, Jedediah to his father in 1772. Very short letter. The basic subject of this letter is the fact that Negro Boston is dead. Jabez must have been away on a business trip, and Jedediah is writing to his father that Boston has died. I strongly suspect that Jabez Huntington paid for and erected this gravestone to Boston. And I believe also that Jabez was, at the very least, intrigued by Boston. Boston was almost definitely born in Africa. Trau was his African name. And I think that he was an object of interest to Jabez, if nothing else at all. There may have been some affection felt there, but we can't tell that. But I think that he was quite intrigued by this African who could tell him stories about Africa and was probably a very intelligent man in his own right. There's some records concerning Boston in Norwich. Here's Boston, adult Negro servant of Daniel Tracy, baptized in 1741. Daniel Tracy lived just around the corner from Jabez Huntington. They were close neighbors. And when Daniel Tracy died in 1760, his probate papers list only one Negro servant, and that is a woman. So sometime between 1741 and 1760, Jabez must have acquired Boston from Daniel Tracy through trade or sale, whatever. And this record below is just a sample of the various baptisms and whatnot listed in the church records in Norwich. And I wanted to include that just to show you that Reverend Benjamin Lord, who was minister of the Congregational Church at that time, was apparently part of the group of people who believed that these enslaved Black people had souls and were eligible to be baptized in the Congregational Church. Not all ministers thought that way. As an example, in Windham, what is now Scotland, Connecticut, the Reverend Ebenezer Devotion doesn't list a single African American person in his church records, and he served approximately the same time that Benjamin Lord did. Here's another mention of Boston. Jason, son of Boston, Negro, baptized November 6, 1743. Now that Jason must have died as an infant, because less than 2 years later, we have Jason, son of Boston, Negro, baptized March 24th, 1745. So Jason is the son of Boston. Let's go back to another letter. Jabez Huntington to his son Joshua Huntington, October 1776. He talks about various things. Domestic news, nothing material, but only the death of Jason last week. Jason, enslaved by the Huntingtons, son of Boston, also enslaved by the Huntington family. One more church record. Boston, Negro, had child, baptized March 1st, 1747. We don't know, cannot possibly tell from this record whether this is a male child or a female child. Baptized 1747. We are getting awfully close to that possible 1750 birth date that we figured out for Samuel. Therefore, I am theorizing that Samuel was actually the son of Boston Trau. It makes sense that he was enslaved by Jabez Huntington, and that after Boston, the Black governor, had died, who better to take over than his son, Samuel? There's still lots of questions concerning this subject, and hopefully someday in the future we can find more information. For now, though, this is what we can show you about the life of Samuel Huntington, Black governor of Connecticut. Thank you.